I was born on the 17th day of March, 1863, Poughkeepsie, New York, right on the Hudson River. My mother used to say I came into this world screaming during a thunderstorm, which she took as a sign of something, though she never told me what exactly. My father, Obadiah Hatch, he wasn't there for my birth. He was somewhere in Virginia with the Union Army, a blacksmith attached to an artillery unit. Didn't meet the man until I was nearly 2 years old, when he came home missing 3 fingers on his left hand and carrying a silence that never quite left him. Now, I want you to understand something about the world I grew up in. When I say it was dark, I don't mean it in some poetic way. I mean it was dark. The sun went down, and that was it. You had candles if you could afford them, kerosene lamps if you were doing better, and if you were poor, you just went to sleep. Our house smelled like tallow and smoke every single night of my childhood. That smell, it gets into everything. Your clothes, your hair, the walls themselves. To this day, I can't smell a candle burning without being 8 years old again, sitting at the kitchen table doing sums while my mother mended clothes by that little yellow flame. The danger of it, though. That's what people today don't understand. Fire was everywhere, and it was hungry. You lived with it, you needed it, but you never trusted it. Every family I knew had a story. The Hendersons lost their barn in '68. The widow Carmichael, she burned half her face reaching for a lamp that tipped over. It was just part of life, the price you paid for seeing anything after sundown. My sister Patience, she was 3 years older than me. Prettiest girl in the county. Everybody said so. In the spring of 1871, she was 14, and I was 8. She was carrying a kerosene lamp across the parlor. I don't remember why. Maybe to help Mother with something in the back room. Her dress caught the edge of the side table. The lamp went over. I remember the sound of the glass breaking, and then there was fire on her skirt, climbing up like it was alive, like it was reaching for her. She screamed, oh Lord, she screamed in a way I'd never heard a person scream before. Father tackled her to the ground, rolled her in a rug, put it out. But the damage, her left arm, her shoulder, part of her neck. She carried those scars for 81 years until the day she died. I learned something that night that took me decades to put into words. Fire was our master, not our servant. We begged it for light, and sometimes it took payment we never agreed to give. My father, he went back to his forge the next morning. Didn't say a word about what happened. But I watched him work that day, shaping iron with flame and hammer, and I saw something in his face. Respect, fear, the same thing really when you're dealing with fire. For years, that's how it was. Candles, kerosene, the occasional gas lamp if you were in the city. I grew up, learned my father's trade, spent my days at the forge learning to bend iron to my will. I was 19 years old in the autumn of 1882 when everything started to change, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Word came down from Manhattan that a man named Thomas Edison had done something impossible. He'd lit up an entire street, Pearl Street they called it, with something called electric light. 85 customers, the newspaper said, all of them with little glass bulbs glowing in their homes and offices, without a single flame. No kerosene, no gas, no wick to trim, just light, clean light. I remember my father reading that article out loud at the dinner table, his voice flat and skeptical. Rich men's toys, he said, won't last the winter. Mother didn't say anything, but I saw her eyes drift to Patience's scars, just for a moment, and I knew she was thinking what I was thinking. The next few years, the arguments started. Reverend Josiah Whitaker, he was our pastor at the First Presbyterian Church, and he took to preaching against this new electricity like it was the devil's own invention. I remember one Sunday, must have been 83 or 84. He stood up there in his black robes and called it the unnatural light, said God gave us fire and the sun, and that ought to be enough for any Christian. Said men who tried to capture lightning were guilty of the sin of pride, same as those who built the Tower of Babel. Some folks nodded along. Others, I could see them shifting in their pews, not so sure. The world was splitting down the middle, and electricity was the wedge. Then Cornelius Van Dorn brought the future to our doorstep. Van Dorn was the richest man in the county, owned the bank and half the farmland between Poughkeepsie and Beacon. In 1884, he had a private generator installed at his estate, hired engineers all the way from New York City to wire his mansion. I was 21 years old, strong from years at the forge, and I needed money, so I signed on as a laborer for the installation crew, digging trenches, hauling equipment, whatever they needed. That's how I first saw it, the electric light, with my own eyes. We finished the wiring on a Thursday evening in October. I remember because the leaves were turning, and there was that smell in the air, that autumn smell. The head engineer, a man named Thaddeus Merriweather, he called us all into the main parlor. There must have been 15 of us standing there in our work clothes, mud on our boots, and Van Dorn himself was there in his fancy suit, looking pleased as a cat with cream. Thaddeus walked over to the wall, put his hand on a little switch, and he said, "Gentlemen, welcome to the 20th century." Then he flipped it, and the room just filled with light. No flickering, no smoke, no heat you could feel on your face. Just this steady, golden glow, like someone had taken a piece of the afternoon sun and trapped it inside a glass bulb. I stood there with my mouth open like a fool. I couldn't help it. I'd never seen anything so beautiful in my entire life. Thaddeus Merriweather saw something in me that night, I suppose. Maybe it was the way I couldn't stop staring at that light bulb, or maybe he just needed someone local who wasn't afraid of hard work. Either way, he pulled me aside before he left town and asked if I'd like to learn the trade. The future needs men who aren't scared of it, he said, and something in those words grabbed hold of me and wouldn't let go. Over the next 2 years, 1885 through 87, Thaddeus came back to the Hudson Valley half a dozen times for various installations, and each time he'd send word ahead, and I'd be there waiting. He taught me about circuits and resistance, about copper wire and insulation, about generators and transformers. I'd go home at night and study the manuals he left me, reading by candlelight about how to harness electricity, and the irony of that wasn't lost on me even then. My father noticed the books, noticed my absences, but he didn't say much. Just watched me with those quiet eyes of his, the same way he watched the fire in his forge, waiting to see what shape the metal would take. Those were strange years for anyone in the electrical trade. You have to understand, there was a war going on, not with guns and armies, but with ideas. Edison and his direct current on one side, Westinghouse and Tesla with their alternating current on the other. The newspapers were full of it, accusations flying back and forth, each side claiming the other system would kill people. Edison, he staged public demonstrations where he electrocuted dogs and horses with alternating current, trying to prove it was too dangerous for homes. They even built an electric chair for executions using Westinghouse's system, just to make people associate it with death. I didn't understand all the science behind the debate, still don't if I'm honest, but I understood fear. I understood what it meant when people heard the word electricity and thought of death instead of light. That was the shadow we worked under, those of us trying to bring power to ordinary folks. In 1887, I met Chester Oglesby. He was about 10 years older than me, a proper trained electrician from Albany who'd been in the trade since the beginning. We worked together on a series of installations in Dutchess County, farmhouses mostly, places where the owners had money and curiosity in equal measure. Chester was the kind of man who whistled while he worked, always had a joke ready, always made the long days feel shorter. He taught me the practical things Thaddeus didn't have time for, the tricks of the trade, how to run wire through old walls without tearing them apart, how to talk to farmers who thought you were bringing the devil into their homes. We became friends, real friends, the kind you don't make many of in a lifetime. The morning of September 14th, 1888, we were finishing an installation at the Forsyth Farm, about 12 miles outside of Poughkeepsie. Hiram Forsyth was a hard man, suspicious of anything new, but his wife had convinced him to try electric light in the kitchen and parlor. We'd been working for 3 days, and we were almost done. Chester was up on a ladder in the barn, connecting the main feed line from the generator, and I was inside the house checking the fixtures. I heard him call out something, couldn't make out the words, and then I heard nothing. That's what I remember most, the silence. I ran outside and found him on the ground, the ladder fallen beside him, and his hand. His hand was still touching the wire. His eyes were open, looking at nothing. I grabbed a wooden board and knocked his arm away from the cable, but I knew. I knew before I even touched him that he was gone. He didn't scream, you see. That's the thing people don't understand about electricity. It doesn't give you time to scream. One moment Chester Oglesby was alive, whistling some tune I can't remember now, and the next moment he simply wasn't. Hiram Forsyth came running out, saw the body, saw me kneeling there, and he started shouting. "Get out," he said. "Get your devil wires off my land and never come back." I don't blame him. I wanted to run too. I quit for 6 months after that. Couldn't look at a wire without seeing Chester's face. Couldn't sleep without hearing that silence where his voice should have been. I went back to my father's forge, tried to pretend the last few years hadn't happened, but the work felt hollow now, meaningless. Then a letter came from my sister Patience. She'd moved to Syracuse by then, married a schoolteacher, built a life for herself, despite everything. She wrote about her daughters, how they did their homework by kerosene lamp every night, how she watched them lean close to the flame and felt her heart stop each time. "How many girls," she wrote, "won't have to fear the lamp because of what you're doing? How many won't carry scars like mine? Chester died bringing light to the world. Don't let his death mean nothing." I read that letter 14 times. Then I packed my tools and went back to work. The next decade of my life, from 1889 to 1899, I spent crawling through attics and digging trenches and stringing wire across the Hudson Valley. I became known as the man you called when you wanted electricity but didn't trust it, because I checked every connection 3 times, sometimes 4. I carried Chester with me on every job, his memory sitting on my shoulder, reminding me what the cost of carelessness looked like. In those 10 years, I wired 847 properties by my count, maybe a few more I've forgotten. Farmhouses, general stores, churches that had finally made peace with the devil's light, even a schoolhouse or 2. Each one felt like a small victory, a tiny push against the darkness that had ruled the world since the beginning of time. But Lord, the resistance we faced. You wouldn't believe how hard it was to convince people that electricity was safe, that it wouldn't burn their houses down or strike their children dead. Farmers were the worst, and I say that with love because I understood them. These were men who'd worked the same land their fathers and grandfathers had worked, using the same tools, the same methods. They didn't trust anything they couldn't see or touch or understand, and electricity was invisible, mysterious, dangerous in ways they couldn't predict. I had doors slammed in my face more times than I can count. Had one old fellow in Rhinebeck chased me off his property with a shotgun, said he'd rather live in darkness than let me bring that cursed current into his home. The churches were divided, too. Some ministers came around eventually, saw the practical benefits, started preaching about how God gave man the wisdom to tame nature's forces. Others held firm, called us agents of pride and destruction, said we were trying to replace the sun that the Almighty had provided. I learned over time that the secret to changing minds wasn't arguing with the men. It was talking to the women, the wives, the mothers, the daughters who spent their days in kitchens lit by smoky lamps, who scrubbed soot off walls and worried every time a child walked past a candle. I started asking to install the first light in the kitchen, always the kitchen, because that's where the women worked, and that's where they'd see the difference most clearly. Once the lady of the house had spent a week cooking and cleaning under clean electric light, once she'd put her children to bed without the fear of fire in her heart, she'd convince her husband better than I ever could. Happy wife, happy life, Chester used to say, and he was right about that too. The winters were brutal on our equipment, I should mention. Generators froze up. Ice storms knocked down poles we'd spent weeks installing. Horses would chew through insulation if you didn't protect the wires properly. One January, I think it was 93 or 94, we lost power to an entire village for 2 weeks because a blizzard took out the main line and the ground was too frozen to dig new post holes. I remember the looks on people's faces when the lights went out, that mixture of disappointment and vindication, like they'd known all along this miracle was too good to last. But we fixed it. We always fixed it. And slowly, season by season, the grid grew stronger and the darkness retreated a little more. In the spring of 1894, I found myself back at the Forsyth farm. 6 years had passed since Chester died there. 6 years since Hiram Forsyth had screamed at me to leave and never return. But his wife, Martha, her eyesight was failing, and she couldn't see well enough to sew by lamplight anymore. A neighbor told me she was talking about electric light, wondering if maybe they'd been too hasty all those years ago. I drove out there on a Tuesday morning, heart pounding the whole way, and I knocked on their door. Hiram answered, older now, grayer, the anger gone from his face and replaced with something tired and sad. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him remembering that terrible day just as clearly as I was. Then he stepped aside and let me in. My wife needs to see, he said. That was all. I did that installation myself. Every wire, every connection, checked it 5 times instead of 3. When I flipped the switch in their kitchen and the light came on, Martha Forsyth stood there with tears running down her cheeks, holding her sewing basket like it was a newborn child. The next year, 1895, I finally convinced my father. He was 67 years old by then, still working the forge, but slower, his hands not as steady as they'd been. I installed a single light in his workshop, and one in the parlor where my mother liked to read. The whole family gathered for the occasion. Patience came down from Syracuse with her husband and daughters, cousins I hadn't seen in years. When I flipped the switch and the parlor filled with that clean, steady glow, everyone clapped and cheered. Everyone except my father. He just stood there, staring at the bulb, his face unreadable. The room went quiet, waiting. Then he turned to look at Patience, at the scars on her neck that she'd stopped trying to hide years ago, and his voice cracked when he spoke. Your sister, he said to me, wouldn't have burned. That was all. He walked outside and didn't come back for an hour. When he did, his eyes were red, and he never mentioned it again. But I understood. After 30 years, my father had finally forgiven himself for not being able to protect his daughter from the fire. And somehow, impossibly, I'd been the one to give him that peace. I'm 94 years old now. 94. I was born during the Civil War, learned to walk by candlelight, and now I sit here in a world I couldn't have imagined as a boy. There's a television set in my living room that shows moving pictures from New York City, and a refrigerator in my kitchen that keeps food cold without a single block of ice. My grandchildren flip switches without thinking, without wondering, without any sense of the miracle they're commanding. And why should they? To them, darkness is just what happens when you forget to pay the electric bill. They'll never know the weight of a kerosene lamp, the fear of a tipped candle, the way night used to swallow everything whole. I think about Chester Oglesby sometimes, more often now than I used to. I think about all the men who died bringing light to this country, the ones who fell off poles and touched the wrong wires, and gave their lives for something they believed in, but would never see completed. There's a cost to progress, always has been. Every light bulb that glows today has a shadow behind it, a story of sacrifice that nobody remembers. I carry those shadows with me, all 847 homes, all the farms and stores and churches, all the families who sat down to dinner under electric light for the first time. I was just one man with a bag of tools and a sister's letter in my pocket, but I was part of something bigger than myself, bigger than any of us understood at the time. My sister Patience passed away 5 years ago, in 1952. She was 95 years old, still had those scars on her neck and arm, still flinched sometimes when she saw an open flame, but she died in a room filled with electric light, surrounded by grandchildren who'd never known the terror of a kerosene lamp, and I think that meant something to her. I know it meant something to me. People ask me sometimes what I think about, looking back on my life, whether I have regrets or wisdom to share. I don't know about wisdom. I'm just an old man who happened to be born at the right time to see the world change. But I'll tell you this. I was born in the age of candles, and I'll die in the age of television and rockets and lights that never go out. If you ask me what was the most extraordinary thing I ever witnessed, I won't talk about wars or presidents or any of that. I'll tell you, I watched the fear of darkness disappear from one farmhouse at a time. And that, I think, is enough for any man's life.